Today's book is The Civil Wars by Appian of Alexandria. And actually, Appian or Appian? I don't know. Sorry, I'm going to mispronounce this horribly. You'll have to forgive me. I've gotten kind of all these names from reading and not from listening so much, so I'm going to kind of mispronounce stuff. Appian, Appian. Anyways, right. There is a lot to talk about in this. And the camera I'm using to video this has a 30-minute limit on the videos. I don't know why. I could get another camera or fix this or something, but I generally figure that maybe giving myself a 30-minute time limit isn't a bad thing. Because if I didn't have the time limit, like I could talk for hours and nobody wants to listen to that. So I'm going to just talk for as much as I can get through, and at 30 minutes the camera's going to shut me off and I probably won't have talked about everything here, but I'll get through what I can in the time I have. So, first of all, what is this? This is an ancient history book. It was written, I think scholars date it to about 162 AD. They date it kind of based on the geographical references. Nobody knows exactly, but that's a figure I read online. Actually, that does sound pretty exact, doesn't it? 162. I don't know. Appian or Appian or whatever was a Greek citizen of the Roman Empire, and he wrote a long history of Rome. Much of which has been lost, but I think there are two books that survive. And I actually forget the other one. But this is one of the ones that survives. It's called The Civil Wars. Appian was Greek, not Roman, so he was writing in Greek. I have the English translation, of course. I don't read Greek. And he somewhat has like an outsider's perspective on this history, even though he was a member of the Roman Empire. When he's talking about kind of the specific customs of the Romans, he'll use kind of language like, this is what the Romans did, you know, different from us Greeks. So, why am I reading this? So the answer is, I have always been interested in ancient history. Way back when I was kind of 17, 18, 19, I went into university as a classics major. Now that's classics in the traditional sense, meaning the study of ancient Rome and Greek. Not you know, classics like just kind of any famous books, but classical studies is kind of the studies of ancient Rome and Greece. And yeah, for a long time I kind of thought this is what I wanted to do. And then, like a lot of young people, I had a hard time making up my mind what I wanted to do. I changed to a general history major, I did history education. At the moment, I am teaching English in Vietnam, so completely removed from any of this. But I still kind of maintain kind of an interest in ancient history, a bit of a fondness for it, and so I like to dabble from time to time. I am somewhat embarrassed to admit how little of the ancient history classics I've actually read. I've read a handful of them, but really not as much as I should have, considering how long I've been interested in this topic. So for a while now, this is something I've been feeling guilty about, and I've been meaning to kind of get back into it, and I don't know, read Herodotus or Thucydides or Plutarch or something like that. The reason I started out with Appian, is because this name kind of came across in a couple different histories I've read recently. Histories meaning kind of secondary histories. Now, this book, The Civil Wars, covers the period from the Gracchi brothers through to Augustus Caesar. So kind of the last 150 years of the Republic, kind of when the Republic was falling apart and the Roman Empire or imperial system was beginning to emerge. So this book was quoted as a source in Rubicon by Tom Holland, which I read about kind of 3 years ago, and The Fall of the Roman Republic by Dan Carlin, or whatever that show was called. Dan Carlin's podcast on the end of the Roman Republic also reference Appian quite frequently. Now I had, despite being a classics major at one point, I had never heard of Appian. I mean, you hear of Livy, you hear of Tacitus, you hear of Herodotus, but like, who has ever heard of Appian? Like, I've never heard of him. I don't know. Have you heard of him? Maybe it's just me. But I went and I did a little bit of research on this, and it turns out Appian wrote, well, what I just said. He wrote kind of the history from the Gracchi brothers to the end of the Republic. Actually, he wrote a much more comprehensive history, but these are kind of the 5 books that survive. Now, this is an interesting period in Roman history because it's one of those periods we know so much about. It's interesting, kind of a quick digression here. When I was a child, I guess I had this view of history that we know the most about the period closest to us, and the farther back you get into history, the less you know. And I guess maybe that's broadly true, but that's not completely true. There are pockets of history where we know a lot, and pockets of history where we don't really know much. And it's not always chronological. For example, we know a lot about the last 100 years of the Roman Republic. We have a lot of ancient writers who are writing about this period, and we've got a lot of these writings have survived. We do not know so much about kind of the 500 years of the early Roman Republic, and there are pockets of the Roman Empire in which we don't have so much sources. So it's not simply a matter of the closer it is in time, the more we know about it. Some periods we just happen to know more about. This is one of the periods where we know a lot about, which makes it kind of a fascinating period of history to study because you're able to get some more kind of complex portraits of these people. Not only kind of the events, we know like the events in a lot of detail, we know some of the politics in a lot of detail, but we also have kind of very complex and full pictures of some of the people from this period. In part because a lot of kind of primary sources have survived from this period, kind of Sallust and Cicero and Caesar and people who actually lived through it had written a lot of material that has kind of survived to us today. The other reason this period of history is so interesting is because a lot was going on, and it was a period of great change in the ancient world, kind of the transition from republic to empire, and it was not a smooth transition. Like the reason it transitioned is because the republic was just falling apart. The institutions could not function with what was going on at the time. So it's a period of history that's kind of very interesting to me. Now, I didn't realize this until I started doing research, but Appian is the only ancient source we have which has a complete narrative of that period. You know, Plutarch has written about Caesar and the Gracchi brothers and Sulla and Marius and a lot of these characters, but Plutarch does kind of more biographies. He doesn't actually kind of write a sweeping narrative history. Livy wrote a lot of Roman history, but Livy's section on this period has been lost. Cicero wrote a lot, but Cicero did not write a comprehensive history of this period. So, like in terms of kind of a sweeping narrative of the whole kind of end of the Republic, Appian's the only kind of surviving source that we have that just kind of starts with the Gracchi brothers and kind of goes all the way through. Sorry, I'm going to qualify that. I say go all the way through. He actually doesn't go all the way through to the final battle between Mark Antony and Octavian. He stops just kind of when they're getting ready for that final showdown. And then the reason apparently why he doesn't do that final fight between them is because he's covered this in another book, his Egyptian history, which kind of is lost, which is lost now. So it's almost the complete history of the fall of the Republic. By the time you get to the end of the book, the Republican institutions are long gone anyways, but we haven't had quite the final showdown between Octavian and Mark Antony. So I found this out and I thought, well, I'm interested in this period of history for all the reasons I just mentioned, and because I've been interested in this period of history, I think I have the background to make a book like this a little bit easier. For example, I'm a little bit afraid if I picked up Thucydides, I wouldn't have a background to really understand the Peloponnesian Wars. But I actually know a lot about this period, so I think I've got the background to help me understand it. Am I bragging there when I say I know a lot about this period? You'll have to forgive me. I think actually what would be more accurate to say, perhaps, is we all know a lot about this period. Everybody knows about Caesar. Everybody knows about Antony and Cleopatra. Everybody knows about Brutus and Cassius. So I think kind of, in broad terms, we all know a lot about this period. This is kind of one of the more famous periods in ancient history. What was I going to say next? I had the background on this, so I was interested in reading it. Yeah, so I set about kind of getting a copy of this. Now, I'm living out in Vietnam right now, so I can't go to the local bookstore. I'm not sure if this would be in the local bookstore, but this passed into the public domain a long time ago, so you can find copies online. I found a copy. The guy who kind of wrote this up is Bill Thayer, Billthayel, yeah, Ayer. He's got the whole thing up on his website. Just search Appian of Alexandria. This will be kind of the first link that comes up anyways. I put this onto a Word document. I brought this down to a print shop. I had them print it out and bind them for me. And so I just kind of used this copy here. And I've been reading this over the past few months. I had a coworker, and a coworker kind of said to me, he saw me reading this, we got into discussion about it, and he said, "Oh wow, that must be quite a difficult read." He was impressed that I was kind of taking on the classics. And I'll take that, if people want to have a heightened view of me and my intellect, I'm not going to dissuade them. But it's not that difficult. The thing about the ancient historians is they were kind of the original kind of narrative historians. They saw history as a story. So they didn't try and do kind of all this academic analysis and kind of talking about the lives of ordinary people and statistics and kind of all this stuff you might find in an academic history nowadays. They were interested in telling a story. Now, they are kind of 2,000 years removed from us, so some of the rhetoric has changed. Some of the storytelling has changed, but if you get a modern translation, it actually reads very smoothly, and it's not a difficult read at all. Boring? Yeah, it can get boring in places. I'll get to some of that later, but it's not difficult. The translation that Bill Thayer uses is the 1913 Loeb Classical Library translation. It doesn't say who translated it. 1913 was a long time ago, but it's modern enough, it reads smoothly enough. It's perfectly readable, albeit it gets a little boring in places, and I'll talk about that later. Or maybe I'll talk about that now, actually. Yeah, now's a good time. So, there were a lot of things I really liked about this book, but I may as well get the negatives out of the way first, so that we don't have to talk about it later. Just get the bad stuff out of the way first. There is a lot of really interesting stuff going on here. And there are a lot of kind of interesting Actually, I'll just leave it at that. I'll come back to talk about that in more detail. There's a lot of really interesting stuff going on here, which I will get to later. But there's a lot of boring stuff going on here as well. So, despite the fact that this period was a period where there were a lot of kind of ideas and ideologies and conflicts of ideologies, there was also a lot of wars. And in retrospect, I should have realized that because the thing is called the Civil Wars. I mean, that's the title of the book. So there is a lot of talk about wars, and if you like military history, great. You'll love this book. I tend to get a little bit bored by it. As a child, I was fascinated by the Iliad and kind of stories of ancient battles, but I've grown out of that now. My interests are kind of different. And also, I think military history can sometimes just degenerate into kind of which armies are moving where. This army moved here, and this army moved here, and this army fortified here, and then this army moved here. Some people really get into that, but it just puts me to sleep. I don't find that interesting. There is a lot of that in this book. So that's not the stuff I was primarily interested in. I put up with it, but it did get to be a slog at times, going through what I considered a lot of kind of information about military history that I didn't really care about. The other thing, this is maybe more of a personal preference, but my own areas of interest are kind of the late Republican period. Kind of, I guess, starting with the Gracchi brothers and maybe ending up to the Civil War between Caesar and Pompey. After that Civil War between Caesar and Pompey finishes, I think the Republican period is essentially over. It gets kind of a long epilogue with a long series of civil wars before Augustus is finally in control. But the period of kind of the Republican factions and the parliamentary politics, which I find really interesting about the late Roman Republic period, that period is over at this point. In Appian's history, that period gets to an end fairly early on. The Civil War between Caesar and Pompey, there are 5 books in this series, and the Civil War between Caesar and Pompey, I think, kicks off in about the middle of book 2. So only maybe the first book and a half are really the parts I'm most interested in. After that, it just kind of goes on with stuff I'm kind of less interested in. Although, there were a couple areas of interest, and maybe I'll have time to pick them out later. Okay. I guess maybe one more criticism while I'm getting all the criticisms out of my way. One of the things I kind of thought when I printed this book out, I thought, okay, I am getting into the real history now, the real nitty-gritty, kind of all the juicy details. But, you know, if you're a history nerd, and I am, then you kind of like all the juicy details. But for the first kind of the first chapter, kind of the last 100 years of the Republic, it actually was very light on details. You weren't getting any of the details. There were a lot of complicated characters in this story, kind of like Cicero and Marius and Cato, where you're only actually really hearing a little bit about them. For example, Gaius Marius, Appian kind of introduces him and says, oh, and Gaius Marius was already in his 6th consulship at this period. And that's how like Gaius Marius gets introduced. And you're like, well, wait a minute. Aren't you going to tell me about his other 5 consulships and his, you know, humble beginnings and how he got into power? And now you're going to give me the information on all of this? And it's not there. If you want this information, other ancient writers have it, but it's not in Appian. So, it's a little bit counterintuitive, but in a way, you're actually kind of getting more detail from a secondary source. Because if you pick up a secondary source, you know, like Tom Holland or Mary Beard or kind of whatever, then they are synthesizing all the information that comes from Plutarch and Cicero and Sallust and Suetonius, and they're putting it all into one narrative with all the details. So this is kind of just one of many sources that modern historians draw on, and it does not have all the details. That being said, actually, some sections are incredibly detailed, particularly kind of, I guess, the last 3 books, where it's the tension between Mark Antony and Octavian. And in that section, I actually got way more information than maybe I wanted or than I knew about. It's interesting to a degree because, you know, the view we have in Shakespeare, right, or kind of the popular view in Shakespeare, after Caesar gets assassinated, Mark Antony and Brutus and Lebetus form an alliance and go after Brutus and Cassius. But actually, in the actual history, it's a lot more complicated. After Caesar got assassinated, there was all these changing alliances. So kind of at first, Antony was with the Senate, and then there's this other guy, Dolabella, who goes over and assassinates this Trebonius guy, and then there's like this question about what's everyone going to do about it. And then Mark Antony goes and he tries to take Nero Gull from, what was the name of the guy up there? I don't remember. And then Octavian comes up, and Octavian actually allies himself with Cicero against Mark Antony. And there's this whole kind of period where Cicero and Octavian and the Senate are kind of together, and Mark Antony is kind of fighting Octavian before they kind of put aside their differences and kind of form an alliance against Brutus and Cassius. And then even then, there's like a lot of changing alliances and kind of incidents and kind of mini conflicts before the final showdown between Mark Antony and Octavian. So there's a lot of kind of interesting stuff in there that I didn't even know about, which is interesting if you're into that stuff. But for kind of the end of the Republican period, there's not quite as much detail. Okay, so what did I like about this book? There is actually a lot to like. One of the things that makes Appian really interesting is he does not take anybody's side in this. He says, okay, well, this person has this perspective, and then this person has this perspective, and they both have their own point of view on this. And I thought that was really interesting. You know, you kind of, maybe this is a little bit of arrogance, but you kind of think ancient writers, they didn't see nuance. Nuance is more of a modern thing. But you know, like Appian totally gets it. He sees nuance here. He sees that there are no good guys or bad guys in history. There's just a bunch of ambitious men kind of competing with each other, and each one is kind of justified according to their own perspectives. Now, the way he gets this across, one of the ways he gets this across, is he makes up a lot of speeches that he puts into the mouths of the characters. So like right before a battle, like they'll address the men and they'll give kind of a long speech. And I think this was fairly common in ancient writers. I've read kind of some other historians who have commented on the practice. They put long speeches into the mouths of historical figures. And I guess what kind of irritates modern historians, or kind of from a modern history perspective, what we don't like, is they write these speeches as if they were historical. So they don't make any caveats. They don't say, okay, I'm just going to imagine what Mark Antony might have said at this situation. They said, no, this is what Mark Antony said. And they write it up as if they expect the reader to believe, you know, that they were there and they wrote it down and stuff like that. Although, I don't know, what was the culture? Did people reading this was it kind of expected that people reading this would know that this wasn't actually historical? I don't know. I had an edition of Josephus at one point by Paul Meyer, who had edited it, and Paul Meyer kind of brags about taking out all of those speeches. He said, don't worry, I'm not going to waste your time with these long speeches that are completely not historical and which are just kind of fictional and made up. I've edited them out so you don't have to bother with them. And I think maybe that's some of the attitude of historians, is like, these are completely without value, just cut them out. But from a literary point of view, if you kind of view this as literature and not history, these speeches are fascinating because he does such a good job of seeing things from everyone's perspective. So for example, he'll give a speech from Brutus and Cassius, and he'll kind of give out all their perspective. And you'll be like, oh yeah, wow. Well, I completely agree with Brutus and Cassius now, seeing things from their perspective. But then Mark Antony will get up to give a speech. And then Appian will show everything from Mark Antony's perspective. And you're like, oh wow, I didn't even think about that. Yeah, I guess Mark Antony has his own perspective. And it's just amazing how Appian is able to get into the heads of all these characters and kind of show that they're all completely justified. I mean, there's an art to that, to be able to kind of take all the sides at once and show them all from their own perspectives. I was impressed. That was well done. So that was kind of all the way through this history, and that was one of the high points. Now that starts all the way in the first book, where he starts his narrative on the Gracchi brothers. Now, actually, before he gets to the Gracchi brothers, Appian kind of has like a little interesting preamble here, where he says, before the Gracchi brothers, there was no civil violence inside Rome. And he says, I know that you think maybe there was, because like you remember the conflicts between the patricians and the plebeians. But Appian says, actually, if you remember that story, maybe people who are classical nerds like me will remember this story. The plebeians go on strike, and they go out and they sit on the hill, and they refuse to kind of help the patricians in the war. And Appian says, you know, that was completely without violence. I mean, sure, there was conflict, but that was a peaceful strike. They just went out and sat on the hill until they got what they wanted. So that was not civil violence. And then Appian says, okay, and I know you remember the story of Corleones. But he said that Corleones wasn't really a story of civil war within Rome. He said Corleones kind of went out to a foreign army, and then anyways he got stopped before he came to Rome anyways, so that whole story doesn't count. So we've got 500 years of Roman history where there was no civil violence within Rome, if you can believe the ancient sources. And I don't know, maybe you don't. Maybe the ancient sources were kind of whitewashing things. Who knows? But it's an interesting idea to contemplate. 500 years of peace, inside the city at least, and then all of a sudden, everything goes to hell for 150 years, and then kind of it all starts with the Gracchi brothers. Now, the Gracchi brothers, again, if you're a history nerd like I am, you know this story. They wanted to do kind of land reform. And it's interesting, I've been reading some debates online about the Gracchi brothers. The Gracchi brothers, of course, tend to be a hero for kind of leftist historians or Marxist historians. Although if you're like a really pure Marxist historian, then you criticize the Gracchi brothers because they were like middle class and they were reformers instead of revolutionaries and stuff like that. But like generally speaking, the Gracchi brothers tend to be looked on favorably by leftist or Marxist historians. And a lot of conservative historians, of course, will attack that and say, no, 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 you're politicizing this, you're kind of making it into like class warfare when it wasn't really class warfare. But it's interesting, modern historians have not politicized the Gracchi brothers. The Gracchi brothers were politicized from the beginning. You read the ancient sources, Plutarch or Appian, and they were giving very kind of polemical views of the Gracchi brothers. I'm out of time already. Sorry, I knew this would happen. I'm not going to have time to get into half the interesting things in this book, but I hope I've given a good introduction to it. I'll just end it there.